My new neighbor thought she'd found the perfect way to destroy 4 generations of family heritage, but her green weapon had one predictable weakness, and I exploited it until she lost everything to her own twisted gift. I discovered my prize-winning heirloom tomatoes had been cut from the vine, and my hands literally shook as I touched the clean cuts, not torn like an animal would do, but sliced with pruning shears. Someone had stolen from my dead grandmother's garden. I inherited this house 6 months ago after she passed and gave up a promotion to move here from across the state because I couldn't let her legacy die. These weren't just plants. That rosebush came from her wedding bouquet 50 years ago. Those tomato seeds had been passed down 4 generations. The herb garden supplied every Sunday dinner I could remember. I'd even placed a memorial stone by her favorite bench where she used to sit and whisper to her plants. I still did that too, wearing her old gardening gloves that smelled like her hand lotion. Working night shifts as a nurse meant I tended the garden at dawn as my meditation and grief processing. The only new thing on our street was Susan, who'd recently married Robert next door. Robert had lived there forever and was HOA president, but seemed decent enough a few times we'd talked. I hadn't met his new wife yet. Through my kitchen window, I saw a woman on their porch talking on her phone and gesturing at my garden. 2 mornings later, I caught her red-handed with a basket full of my vegetables. She smiled and said she was helping me harvest, since the garden looked overwhelming for one person. She claimed Robert told her it was community space for the whole street. My grandmother had been generous, but this felt wrong. I swallowed my anger and offered to teach her to grow her own garden, and even gave her one of my heirloom tomato seedlings in one of my grandmother's hand-painted pots. She cooed about how sweet I was while making comments about the overgrown mess. The next morning, I was watering when the garbage truck rumbled down our street. I watched in horror as my gifted plant, still in grandmother's ceramic pot, got tossed from Susan's bin into the truck. The pot shattered in the crusher. That deliberate disrespect turned my hurt to anger. My security camera started catching her taking vegetables every dawn while I worked. She complained to neighbors about my garden attracting pests. Robert was always conveniently at work during her activities. After 2 weeks of theft, I installed a small fence with a polite private garden sign. I came home to find it torn down with Susan claiming it was on her property. She'd filed an HOA complaint about my eyesore garden. Then I found my grandmother's memorial stone hidden behind the shed. During our confrontation, she let something slip that explained everything. She said Robert wouldn't shut up about my grandmother's perfect garden when they were dating. She saw my garden as competition for his admiration. Yet I'd seen her hosting garden parties taking credit for growing everything herself. She hated what it represented but craved the status it brought. The HOA violations kept coming, obviously influenced by Susan's pillow talk with Robert. Neighbors started avoiding me, not wanting to anger the HOA president's wife. I researched property lines and found the old survey markers proving the garden was mine. I documented everything and installed more cameras. When I caught her on video salting the ground near grandmother's rosebush, I confronted her with the evidence and threatened to call the police. She apologized with fake tears and promised to stop. 2 weeks of peace passed and I started to relax. My friends convinced me I needed a vacation after all the stress. I hesitated to leave the garden, but neighbors promised to water everything, and Susan had been avoiding me, completely staying inside whenever I was outside. Maybe she'd finally learned her lesson. I spent 2 weeks at the beach posting happy photos and finally feeling human again. The salt air and distance gave me perspective. I returned home tanned and refreshed, ready to embrace my grandmother's garden with new energy. But something felt off as I walked up the path. Strange shoots poked up along our shared fence line. My heart sank as I recognized the distinctive segmented stalks. Bamboo. Running bamboo to be specific. The most invasive species you could legally plant. In just 2 weeks, it had already grown 3 feet tall, and the underground runners were heading straight for my garden. That witch had waited until I left to plant her revenge. I stood there staring at the bamboo forest she'd started, knowing it could destroy everything within months. The roots would strangle my grandmother's roses and crack the foundation of her greenhouse. This wasn't just petty theft anymore. This was botanical warfare. I pulled out my phone and started Googling the most aggressive plants legal to grow, because if she wanted to play dirty, I was done being the nice guy with a dead grandmother's garden. I spent that whole night researching bamboo removal methods. The more I read, the worse it got. Running bamboo could spread 30 feet underground in a single season. The roots went down 6 feet. Once established, it was nearly impossible to unalive. I'd need to dig trenches 3 feet deep around my entire garden. Even then, any root fragment left behind would sprout again. I couldn't sleep thinking about those runners creeping toward my tomatoes. The next morning, I grabbed a shovel and started digging. My back screamed after 2 hours, but I'd only made it 10 feet. Jennifer watched from her window, sipping coffee. She waved cheerfully when she caught me looking. I wanted to throw the shovel at her smug face. Instead, I kept digging until my hands were raw with blisters. The morning sun climbed higher, and sweat dripped into my eyes, but I couldn't stop. Every shovelful of dirt felt like a small victory against her invasion. I called a landscaper for a quote on bamboo barriers. He laughed when he saw the situation, told me it would cost $8,000 minimum, said I should have acted sooner. The bamboo had already spread under the fence. He pointed out new shoots popping up in my herb garden. My stomach dropped. $8,000 was more than I had in savings after paying for Grandma's funeral and moving expenses. That's when I remembered something. Grandma used to complain about the previous owners of Jennifer's house. They'd installed some fancy septic system after their old one failed. She said they bragged about the expensive French drain system that ran along our property line, said it cost them 20 grand back in the 90s. She'd always rolled her eyes when telling that story, saying some people had more money than sense. I wondered if Jennifer knew about it. I spent the next week in a desperate battle. Every morning before work, I'd find new bamboo shoots. I'd cut them down and they'd grow back overnight. The roots were spreading faster than I could dig. My beautiful garden started looking like a war zone. Trenches everywhere, piles of dirt, dying plants where I'd accidentally severed their roots while digging. The lavender that Grandma had planted for my 10th birthday was wilting, and I nearly cried when I had to pull out her prized basil plants to dig another defensive trench. Dennis finally approached me one evening. He seemed genuinely confused about the bamboo situation, asked why I'd let it get so bad. I told him Jennifer planted it while I was on vacation. His face went pale. He muttered something about checking with her and hurried inside. I heard them arguing through the open windows. Phrases like property values and what were you thinking drifted across the fence. The bamboo kept spreading. Within a month, it had taken over a quarter of my garden. My heritage tomatoes were struggling. The rosebush looked sickly. I tried every natural method I could find. Vinegar, boiling water, salt. Nothing worked. The bamboo just kept coming. Each failed attempt felt like losing another piece piece of grandma. I started noticing something interesting though. The bamboo seemed to grow faster along the fence line. The shoots there were thicker, healthier. I remembered the landscaper mentioning that bamboo loved moisture. That French drain system must be providing perfect conditions. An idea started forming. If I couldn't hit the bamboo, maybe I could guide it. Instead of fighting the bamboo everywhere, I focused on one thing. I created barriers directing it away from my garden beds, used metal sheeting, concrete blocks, anything I could find. But I left the fence line completely open, even started watering that area extra heavy. The bamboo took the path of least resistance, following the water like a river follows its banks. Jennifer noticed my changed tactics. She'd smirk whenever she saw me watering near the fence. Probably thought I'd given up. She started having more garden parties, still claiming credit for vegetables she'd stolen from me months ago. Her guests would compliment her green thumb while I sweated in the trenches next door. I overheard her telling someone she was thinking of entering the county fair with her tomatoes. The bamboo grew like crazy along the property line, 15 feet tall now, thick as a jungle. Jennifer seemed pleased with her green wall blocking my ugly garden from view. She had no idea what was happening underground. Those runners were following the moisture, spreading deep and wide exactly where her septic system lay. Nature has its own form of justice, and I was just helping it along. I kept detailed notes and took photos daily, documented every new shoot, every inch of spread. The bamboo was doing exactly what I'd hoped, following the French drains, sending runners deep into her property. The system that cost 20 grand was about to become very expensive lawn art. My grandmother would have appreciated the poetic justice of it all. 3 months after the bamboo appeared, I noticed Jennifer's yard looking soggy, just a small wet patch at first near the fence. She had landscapers out there adding soil, improving drainage. They had no idea what was really happening underground. The bamboo roots were already wrapped around those pipes like pythons. Soon enough, those roots would find every weak spot, every joint, every tiny crack in that expensive system. And when they did, Jennifer would learn that some gardens fight back. I kept watering that fence line religiously, every morning before my shift at the hospital, every evening when I got home, sometimes even sneaking out with a flashlight if I'd worked a double. The bamboo loved it, shooting up faster than I'd ever seen plants grow. Within weeks, what had been sparse shoots became a dense wall of green. Jennifer started complaining to Dennis about the jungle between our properties. I heard her shrill voice through my kitchen window one Saturday morning, saying it made their yard feel closed in, like living in a prison. Dennis, ever the peacemaker, suggested she trim it back to a reasonable height. She said that was my responsibility since it was growing on my side of the property line. He reminded her, with barely concealed frustration, that she had planted it herself. That shut her up real quick. I smiled into my coffee cup, remembering how smug she'd looked that day, planting what she thought would be her secret weapon against my garden. The wet spot in her yard grew bigger each week, spreading like an oil stain across her perfect lawn. She had different landscaping companies out every few days, a parade of trucks and confused professionals. They'd walk the property with furrowed brows, scratch their heads, dig test holes, add more drainage pipes, install French drains, and charge her hundreds of dollars for each failed attempt. The spot would dry up for a few days, giving her false hope, then come back worse than before. I watched from my kitchen window as they brought in specialized equipment, moisture meters, and ground-penetrating radar. They were getting close to finding the real problem, but not quite there yet. One younger landscaper kept staring at the bamboo in the wet areas, clearly making connections, but Jennifer would redirect his attention elsewhere whenever he got too curious. My garden started recovering once I got the bamboo under control on my side. The tomatoes bounced back first, their leaves returning to deep green instead of the sickly yellow they'd been. The roses bloomed again, more vibrant than ever, as if celebrating their freedom. I even managed to save most of the herb garden that Jennifer had ransacked, coaxing the basil and oregano back to life with careful pruning and fertilizer. Started posting photos on social media of my harvest, making sure to capture the morning dew on the heirloom tomatoes, the perfect spiral of the climbing beans. Made sure to tag the location so neighbors could see the abundance growing in what Jennifer had called an eyesore. Her friends started asking at their weekly wine gatherings why her garden wasn't producing like mine. She told them she was focusing on landscaping this year, not vegetables, that food gardens were really rather déclassé anyway. One misty morning I found her in my garden again, not stealing this time, just standing there among my tomato plants, staring at them with an expression I couldn't quite read. She was wearing her silk pajamas and designer garden clogs, looking utterly out of place among the honest dirt and growing things. She jumped when she saw me, nearly knocking over a steak, claimed she was looking for her cat, Mr. Whiskers. She didn't have a cat, never had in all the years they'd lived there. I told her to leave immediately. She said I was being unreasonable, that neighbors should share their abundance, that it was the Christian thing to do. I reminded her about the bamboo forest she'd planted, about finding her stealing my vegetables, about the HOA complaints. She said the bamboo was a gift to create privacy, that we'd both benefit from it. We both knew she was lying, but she maintained eye contact, that practiced sincerity that probably worked on Dennis, but had never fooled me. The soggy spot in her yard turned into a proper swamp within a month. The grass died completely, leaving bare mud that squelched when you walked near it. You could smell something off about it, especially on warm days. Not quite sewage, but definitely not right, like stagnant water mixed with something chemical. She had a pool party planned for the following weekend, had been bragging about it for months. Their annual summer gathering where she showed off her perfect home to all their country club friends. She spent all week in a panic trying to fix the yard, had trucks delivering sand by the ton, gravel, even brought in expensive sod from a specialty company. She personally supervised the workers, barking orders demanding they work faster. Nothing worked. The ground just swallowed everything up like a hungry mouth, the new sod sliding into the muck within hours. I decided to be helpful, or at least appear to be. Knocked on their door on a Thursday evening with a plate of cookies made with my garden herbs, rosemary shortbread, my grandmother's recipe. Jennifer answered, looking more stressed than I'd ever seen her, with dark circles under her eyes and her usually perfect hair in disarray. I mentioned casually that I'd noticed their yard trouble, that it must be so frustrating with the party coming up, offered to recommend the landscaper who'd helped me with the bamboo situation. She practically begged for his number, her pride crumbling in the face of desperation. I gave it to her with my sweetest smile. He was the same guy who'd told me about bamboo loving moisture, how its roots seek out water sources with devastating efficiency. He'd figure out the problem real quick, I assured her. The landscaper, Larry Martinez, came out 2 days later. I watched from my garden as he walked the property with Jennifer and Dennis, his expression growing more serious by the minute. He kept pointing at the bamboo forest, then at the wet areas, then back at the bamboo. He got down on his knees at one point, digging into the muck with his bare hands, pulling up what looked like white threads, bamboo roots. Dennis's face got redder and redder as Larry explained what was happening. Jennifer kept shaking her head violently, insisting it couldn't be the bamboo. That bamboo was just a grass, harmless. Larry pulled out his tablet, showing them photos of similar damage he'd seen. The landscaper left after an hour of heated discussion. They didn't look happy. That evening I heard them arguing again through their open windows. Dennis's voice carried clearly through the summer air, something about $20,000 minimum and insurance not covering self-inflicted damage. Jennifer's voice rose to a shriek, insisting it wasn't self-inflicted, that she'd been sabotaged. Jennifer's pool party happened anyway. She'd covered the worst areas with painted plywood and strategic decorations, potted plants, outdoor rugs, even a few garden statues placed to block the view. Told guests they were doing renovations, planning a Japanese garden. Halfway through the party, just as Jennifer was holding court about her landscape plans, one of the boards cracked. A guest's designer heel went right through into the muck below. The smell that came up, rotten eggs mixed with sewage, cleared the patio in seconds. People grabbed their drinks and fled to the front yard. The party ended real quick after that, guests making excuses about early mornings and forgotten appointments. I watched from my bedroom window as Jennifer stood alone on her patio, surveying the disaster, her perfect party in ruins. Monday morning brought septic trucks, big ones with heavy-duty pumps and tanks, the kind that pump out whole systems, not just routine maintenance. They spent hours working while Jennifer paced the driveway, cell phone pressed to her ear, presumably arguing with insurance companies. I heard the lead technician explain in patient detail that bamboo roots had infiltrated the entire drainage system. The roots had crushed pipes like paper straws, blocked filters, completely destroyed the leach field, would need full replacement of the entire system. Insurance wouldn't cover it since she'd planted the bamboo herself. It was considered negligent maintenance. The technician showed her photos on his phone of the root mass they'd pulled out, white tentacles wrapped around every pipe like some underground monster. She tried to blame me, her voice rising to hysteria. Told the septic company I'd planted the bamboo to sabotage her property, that I'd watered it deliberately to direct the roots toward her system. The technician looked at where the bamboo originated, clearly on her side of the fence, the original planting holes still visible. He shook his head and went back to work, unmoved by her tears. She stood there sputtering about property lines and hostile neighbors, about lawsuits and damages. Nobody was listening. Even Dennis had gone inside, leaving her to rant alone in the driveway. The smell got worse over the next few days as the damaged system backed up completely. Raw sewage had been leaking into her yard for weeks, the technicians discovered. The health department showed up after multiple neighbors complained about the stench. They posted a bright orange notice on her door. The house was uninhabitable until the septic was fixed and the contaminated soil remediated. Jennifer and Dennis had to move into a hotel that afternoon. I saw them loading suitcases into their Mercedes. Dennis wouldn't even look at Jennifer, his jaw clenched tight. She kept trying to talk to him, gesturing wildly, but he just loaded bags in silence. My cousin Michelle came to visit that weekend. She's a master gardener, teaches sustainable agriculture at the community college, writes for gardening magazines. I showed her around Grandma's garden, told her the whole story over iced tea on the porch. She laughed until she cried when she saw the bamboo forest, said it was the most elegant revenge she'd ever seen. Nature's justice, she called it. We spent the afternoon harvesting vegetables and making salsa with Grandma's recipe, the one she'd never written down but taught me by feel and taste. Michelle helped me can a dozen jars, and we talked about Grandma, about the legacy of these plants, about how gardens remember everything. The construction crews arrived Monday morning at 7 sharp. Massive excavators that shook the ground, dump trucks lined up down the street, workers in hazmat suits. They had to tear up Jennifer's entire backyard to access the septic system. The bamboo had to come out too, every bit of it, or the problem would just happen again. I watched them dig down 6 feet, then 8, then 10, pulling out massive root balls that looked like giant white spiders. Some of those roots were thick as my arm, twisted and gnarled from their underground battle with the pipes. They filled truck after truck with contaminated soil, bamboo roots, and destroyed pipe sections. Jennifer showed up while they were digging, screeching to a halt in the driveway. Started screaming at the crew about being careful with her lawn, about saving her Japanese maple, about the expense. The foreman, a patient man named George, showed her the bamboo roots wrapped around the crushed pipes like boa constrictors. Explained how this would keep happening unless they got every single root, how bamboo could regenerate from a piece the size of a fingernail. She turned to glare at me over the fence where I was training my pole beans. I waved cheerfully and went back to pruning my roses, humming one of Grandma's favorite songs. The project took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of diesel engines running from dawn to dusk. 3 weeks of beeping trucks backing up every few minutes and workers shouting instructions over the noise. 3 weeks of Jennifer's beautiful yard being turned into a moonscape of churned earth and gaping holes. They had to bring in special equipment to sift the soil for root fragments, like archaeologists looking for pottery shards. Even tiny pieces could regrow into new bamboo forests, George explained to anyone who would listen. The neighbors gathered each evening to watch the progress, shaking their heads at the destruction. Dennis started spending more time outside during the construction, despite the noise and dust. He'd stand at the fence watching them work, sometimes with a beer, sometimes just staring. I could see him calculating the cost in his head, his face growing more haggard each day. Sometimes he'd look over at my thriving garden with something like regret, maybe remembering the vegetables I'd shared with them when they first moved in, before Jennifer decided my garden was an affront to her aesthetic. One evening he apologized for not believing me about Jennifer's behavior, said he should have paid more attention, should have known something was wrong when she became obsessed with my garden. I told him gardens had a way of revealing people's true nature, that plants were honest in ways people rarely were. He nodded sadly and went back to watching his savings disappear into the ground. The final bill came to $32,000. I know because Jennifer shrieked the number loud enough for the whole street to hear, her voice cracking with rage. Insurance covered $0. The bamboo was considered an intentional planting that caused predictable damage. The adjuster had found similar cases online. Plus they found out she'd lied on the claim forms about when it was planted, said it had been there when they bought the house. Dennis's face looked gray when he signed the check, his hand shaking slightly. Jennifer stormed inside, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. My garden exploded with growth that summer. Without the bamboo stealing nutrients and water, everything flourished beyond my wildest dreams. The heritage tomatoes produced more than I'd ever seen, heavy trusses of fruit bending the stakes. I had so much produce I started a small stand at the end of my driveway. Built it myself with reclaimed wood, painted it sage green like Grandma's old potting shed. Put out an honor system cash box and bags of fresh vegetables sorted by type. Neighbors loved it, stopping by on their morning walks or after work. Even people from other streets started stopping by. Word spreading about the quality of the heritage varieties. Jennifer hated that vegetable stand with a passion that bordered on obsession. She'd complain to anyone who'd listen about the traffic, maybe 3 cars an hour. The eyesore. It was featured in the local paper's garden section. The unfairness of it all. But what could she do? I had permits from the city. The HOA rules she'd tried to use against me actually protected agricultural use of property, a remnant from when this was all farmland. Dennis had to remind her of that when she wanted to file another complaint, his voice tired and defeated. The irony was delicious as my sun-ripened tomatoes, which were selling faster than I could pick them. One morning I found a note in my cash box, folded around a bill. Your grandmother would be proud. The garden is beautiful. Sorry for everything. D. Inside was a $100 bill. I looked over at their house through the morning mist. Dennis was sitting on their porch with coffee, watching the sunrise alone. He nodded when he saw me, a small sad smile on his face. We never spoke about it directly, but he started buying vegetables regularly after that, always leaving more money than necessary. Jennifer tried one last desperate move in September. She hired a lawyer, some shark from downtown who specialized in property disputes, claimed the bamboo had actually originated on my property, that I'd trained it to grow toward her yard, wanted me to pay half the septic costs plus damages for intentional infliction of emotional distress. The lawyer came out to look at the situation, arriving in a car that cost more than my annual salary. I showed him my security footage from the week I was on vacation 2 years ago. Crystal clear video of Jennifer planting bamboo along the fence, time-stamped and date-stamped. Even showed her tamping down the soil, watering the new plants. The lawyer watched it twice, took some notes, then told her she had no case and left. She screamed at him in the driveway, threatened to report him to the bar. He drove away without looking back. The new septic system worked perfectly, but their yard was ruined. Just dirt and sparse grass where lush lawn used to be, like a scar across the landscape. Jennifer hired landscapers to fix it, but nothing grew well. Turns out the bamboo removal chemicals had poisoned the soil. Would take years to recover fully without expensive remediation. She destroyed her own paradise trying to destroy mine. Sometimes karma comes in the form of invasive plants, I thought, remembering Grandma's saying about reaping what you sow. I kept expanding my garden operation through the fall. Added a greenhouse using money from the vegetable stand. Nothing fancy, but solid and functional. Started growing year-round, extending the season for tomatoes and peppers, starting seeds in the dead of winter. The local farmers market invited me to have a booth after the market manager stopped by my stand. I dedicated it to my grandmother's memory, put up her photo from the 1960s, her standing in this very garden, put up photos of her throughout the decades, shared stories about the heritage plants and their journeys to this plot of land. People loved knowing the history behind their food, the continuity of seeds saved year after year. Jennifer and Dennis separated by fall. He moved into an apartment downtown, a small place near his office. She stayed in the house but rarely came outside anymore. When she did venture out, she'd scurry to her car, avoiding eye contact with everyone. The neighbors who'd shunned me after Jennifer's complaints started coming around again, sheepishly at first, then with genuine warmth. Turns out they'd never liked Jennifer but were scared of HOA retaliation. She'd gotten the previous board president removed over a dispute about fence heights. With Dennis gone from the board, that threat disappeared like morning dew. Sarah from across the street became my gardening buddy. She'd lost her husband last year to cancer and needed something positive to focus on, something life-affirming. We worked together most mornings before the heat, sharing stories and preserving Grandma's techniques. She'd known my grandmother years ago, remembered buying tomatoes from her. She helped me document all the heritage varieties, their histories, growing instructions, the stories behind each one. We even started a cookbook with recipes using the garden produce, Sarah testing each recipe multiple times until they were perfect. Winter came and Jennifer's house went on the market just before Thanksgiving. The realtor had trouble selling it despite the good neighborhood. Potential buyers would ask about the destroyed backyard, the new septic system, why such extensive work was needed on a relatively new house. Word had gotten around the neighborhood about the bamboo incident. These things always do in small communities. Property values matter in HOA communities, and everyone knew this house came with a difficult history and a ruined yard that would take years to restore. I felt bad for Dennis though. He'd stop by occasionally on Saturday mornings to buy vegetables and chat. Told me he'd inherited that house from his parents, had lived there 40 years before Jennifer, met his first wife in that backyard, married her under the oak tree that Jennifer had cut down, raised his kids there, taught them to ride bikes in the driveway. Now he'd lost it all because he'd married someone who couldn't stand seeing others happy, who viewed any success but her own as a personal attack. He said the expensive lesson was worth learning before it was too late, before he wasted more years. He was seeing a therapist, he admitted, trying to understand how he'd been so blind. The house finally sold in spring, after sitting empty all winter, way below asking price. The buyers knew about the soil contamination, the bamboo risk, the whole saga. Jennifer disappeared without saying goodbye to anyone, the moving truck arriving at dawn and leaving before noon. The new owners were a young family with 3 kids, the Nguyens. They asked about the bamboo situation first thing, having heard rumors. I told them the whole story over coffee and cookies. They laughed and said they'd stick to normal plants, maybe some raised beds for vegetables. We became good friends quickly. Their kids loved helping in my garden, learning about the plants just like I had with Grandma, their small hands gentle with seedlings. I kept finding little surprises Jennifer had left behind, nails hammered into my fence posts at odd angles that I discovered while repairing a board, salt poured along sections of the property line where I'd noticed bare patches. Most shocking was when the apple tree started declining rapidly. When I finally had it examined by an arborist, we found concrete that had been poured around some of the major roots, probably during those 2 weeks of peace before my vacation. Each discovery made me glad she was gone, but also sad for her, that she'd spent so much energy on destruction. But my garden was stronger than her petty sabotage. Plants that survive adversity grow the strongest roots, the deepest connections to the earth. Grandma taught me that during a drought year when I was 12. The vegetable stand turned into a proper farm store by the next summer. I quit nursing to run it full-time, my back grateful for the career change. Felt like Grandma guiding me toward what I was meant to do all along. The heritage varieties became locally famous, featured in restaurant menus with my farm's name. Food bloggers wrote articles about preserving agricultural heritage. That garden I'd inherited inherited wasn't just surviving, it was becoming everything Grandma had dreamed of and more. School groups came for tours, learning about sustainable agriculture and the importance of seed saving. Sometimes I'd catch myself talking to the plants like she used to, asking the tomatoes how they were feeling, encouraging the beans to climb higher. Wearing her old gloves, soft leather formed to hands not much different from mine, using her tools worn smooth by decades of use. The memorial stone was back by her bench where it belonged, surrounded now by a herb garden spelling out her initials in different varieties of thyme. Jennifer had tried to erase that legacy, but only made it stronger, like pruning that encourages new growth. Every seed that sprouted felt like a tiny victory against those who'd try to destroy something beautiful out of jealousy. The bamboo never came back on our street. The new neighbors were vigilant about any suspicious shoots, and the whole neighborhood had learned to identify bamboo starts. We all learned that lesson well. Sometimes a gift is really a curse in disguise, but sometimes on quiet mornings, when the dew was heavy and the birds just starting to sing, I'd look at that fence line and smile. Nature had fought my battle for me with more effectiveness than any human intervention. All I'd done was give it a little direction, a little extra water. Grandma would have called it working with the land instead of against it, finding the flow instead of forcing your will. My cousin Michelle helped me start teaching gardening classes in the greenhouse that winter. We focused on heritage varieties and sustainable practices, composting, seed saving, the old ways that were becoming new again. The first class filled up in hours, a waiting list forming immediately. People were hungry for this knowledge, for connection to the earth, for something real in an increasingly artificial world. Jennifer had tried to steal that from me, from the community. Instead, her actions had helped create something bigger than either of us imagined. The classes grew into a certification program, partnering with Michelle's college. The HOA even changed their rules about gardens the following spring. Dennis pushed it through before he left the board, his last act as president. Now every house could have food gardens without permits or restrictions, chickens if they wanted, rain barrels and compost bins. What started as one woman's petty jealousy ended up benefiting the whole neighborhood. Sometimes the worst attacks against us become catalysts for positive change, forcing growth we didn't know we needed. Grandma would have loved that bit of poetry, would have seen the divine humor in it. One day I was harvesting tomatoes in late summer, the plants heavy with fruit, when a familiar car drove slowly past. Jennifer, in a rental car with out-of-state plates. She looked older, tired, her perfect hair now showing gray at the roots. She slowed down near my driveway, staring at the thriving garden, the busy farm stand with its line of customers, the greenhouse glowing in the morning sun, the life she'd tried so hard to destroy now flourishing beyond anything she could have imagined. Our eyes met for a moment through her car window. I didn't wave. Neither did she. She drove on and never came back. Some people can't stand seeing others succeed, can't bear joy that isn't their own. But gardens don't care about human pettiness. They just grow, reaching always toward the light, roots deep in the earth, connected to something larger than any individual grievance. They remember everything but forgive it all, covering scars with new growth, transforming poison into possibility. I kept teaching those gardening classes through the winter. The greenhouse stayed warm, even when snow piled up outside. People loved learning about seed starting and winter vegetables. One student, Andrew, turned out to be a reporter for the regional newspaper. He wanted to do a feature story about heritage gardens and sustainable farming. I agreed, but made him promise to focus on the plants, not the drama with Jennifer. He interviewed me for 3 hours, took hundreds of photos, even brought a professional photographer who spent a whole day capturing the garden in different light. The article came out in March with a full-page spread. Beautiful photos of the heritage tomatoes, the rose bush from Grandma's wedding, me teaching a class in the greenhouse. The headline read, "Local garden preserves 4 generations of agricultural heritage." They mentioned the farm stand, the classes, how I'd quit nursing to follow this path. What they didn't mention was Jennifer or the bamboo or any of that mess. Just a positive story about preserving family traditions and feeding the community. Orders started pouring in after that article. Restaurants wanted to buy wholesale. The farmers market offered me a permanent corner spot with extra space. A publisher reached out about doing a cookbook featuring heritage recipes. I had to hire help just to keep up with demand. Found 2 part-time workers, Eden and Taylor, both college students studying agriculture. They reminded me of myself at that age, eager to learn everything about plants. Dennis stopped by one April morning with news. He'd heard from mutual friends that Jennifer was living in Arizona now. Apparently, she'd tried to start a landscaping business out there. It failed within 6 months. She'd burned through her divorce settlement trying to make it work, hiring expensive consultants and buying equipment she didn't know how to use. Now she was working as a receptionist at a dental office. He didn't seem happy about it, just tired. Said he'd finally finished paying off the septic system debt. The Nguyen family next door turned their backyard into something beautiful that spring. They planted fruit trees, built raised beds, even put in a small pond. Their kids would run over to show me every new sprout, every flower, every tiny green tomato. Their youngest, Lily, reminded me of myself at that age. She had that same wonder about growing things, that patience to watch and wait. I gave her some of Grandma's easiest seeds to start with, showed her how to plant them just right. My farm stand needed expanding by summer. The honor system wasn't working anymore with so much traffic. I hired Sarah to run it 3 days a week while I focused on growing and teaching. She turned out to have a real talent for customer service, remembering everyone's names and preferences. She'd save the best tomatoes for pregnant women, claiming they needed the nutrients most. Always had free samples cut up, recipes printed out, stories about each variety ready to share. One morning, I found a package on my doorstep with no return address. Inside was Grandma's missing garden journal, the one I'd looked everywhere for after she died. Every page filled with her careful handwriting, planting dates, weather observations, seed-saving notes going back decades. The last entry was just a week before she passed. At the very back, tucked into the binding, was a note. Found this when packing. Thought you should have it. Jay. I sat on Grandma's bench and cried, holding that journal. Not sad tears, just overwhelmed. Even Jennifer, in all her bitterness, had recognized this belonged with the garden. Maybe she'd kept it as leverage initially, or out of spite, but somewhere in her exile, she'd decided to return it. I'd never forgive her for the damage she'd caused, but I was grateful to have Grandma's words back. The journal transformed everything. It had varieties I thought were lost forever, techniques I'd half remembered, stories about where each plant came from. One entry described how her mother had smuggled tomato seeds from Italy in the hem of her dress. Another detailed the rose cutting from her wedding bouquet, how she'd rooted it in a potato. There were recipes I'd never seen, remedies using garden herbs, moon planting schedules that actually worked. I started a blog to share the journal entries, typing them up exactly as written. The response was incredible. People from all over shared their own family garden stories, sent seeds their grandparents had saved, asked questions about techniques. It became this beautiful community of gardeners preserving heritage varieties. A university professor even used it in her ethnobotany course, showing how immigrant communities preserve their cultures through seeds. The cookbook publisher loved the journal angle. We restructured the whole book around Grandma's entries, matching recipes to seasons, including her stories about each plant. The photography team spent a week at the garden, capturing it at dawn, in rain, under the harvest moon. They wanted authentic shots, dirt under fingernails, imperfect vegetables, the real work of growing food. The book pre-sold 5,000 copies before it even printed. Fall brought the biggest harvest I'd ever seen. The expanded garden produced more than I could process alone. Sarah suggested we host a harvest festival, invite the whole neighborhood to pick vegetables for donation, make it a celebration of abundance rather than hoarding it all. We planned it for a Saturday in October, sent flyers to every house, posted on social media. I worried nobody would come. Over 200 people showed up. Families with wagons, elderly folks with baskets, teenagers dragged by their parents who ended up having fun. We picked everything right, sorted it into boxes for the food bank. Kids painted pumpkins while adults shared recipes. The Nguyens brought Vietnamese spring rolls made with my herbs. Someone else brought apple cider from their own trees. It felt like the neighborhood gatherings Grandma used to describe from her childhood. Andrew the reporter came back to cover the festival. This time he brought a video crew, making a documentary about community gardens and food security. He interviewed dozens of people, all with stories about the garden, how it had brought neighbors together, taught kids where food came from, preserved cultural heritage. Dennis was there too, helping load boxes for the food bank. He looked healthier than I'd seen him in years, laughing with other volunteers. We collected over 3,000 pounds of produce that day. The food bank director nearly cried when we delivered it all, said it was the largest single donation they'd ever received from a home garden. The vegetables would feed hundreds of families, all heritage varieties most people had never tasted. We made it an annual tradition after that, the harvest festival becoming as important as any holiday. Winter came early that year, but the greenhouse kept producing. I expanded the class schedule, adding workshops on preserving and canning. Sarah taught sessions on freezing and dehydrating. We processed hundreds of pounds of tomatoes into sauce, teaching people skills their grandparents took for granted. The greenhouse became a community hub during those cold months, always someone stopping by to chat or learn or buy vegetables for dinner. The cookbook launched in spring to amazing reviews. Food bloggers called it essential reading for heritage gardeners. The publisher arranged a book tour, but I only agreed to local events. Couldn't leave the garden during planting season. Instead, we hosted events at the farm, author readings in the greenhouse, cooking demonstrations using fresh ingredients. People drove from hours away to attend, buying signed books and seedlings to start their own heritage gardens. A film crew showed up in May wanting to feature the garden in a documentary about sustainable agriculture. They'd heard about the bamboo incident somehow, wanted to include it as an example of garden warfare. I declined to discuss Jennifer or any of that drama, told them they could film the garden and the community programs, but the past was past. They spent 3 days filming anyway, interviewing customers and students and neighbors about what the garden meant to them. The summer solstice brought another milestone. The heritage tomato variety I'd submitted to the Seed Savers Exchange was officially accepted into their collection. They'd grown test plots, verified its unique characteristics, documented its history from Grandma's journal. Now those seeds would be preserved forever, available to gardeners worldwide. Grandma's tomatoes had achieved immortality in the best possible way. My life had completely transformed in 3 years, from night shift nurse to full-time farmer, from grieving granddaughter to community educator. The garden supported me financially now, between the farm stand, classes, cookbook royalties, and speaking engagements. But more importantly, it connected me to hundreds of people who shared this passion for growing food and preserving heritage. Jennifer's house next door had become a blessing with the Nguyen family. Their garden complemented mine, creating a whole block of food production. Other neighbors started gardens too, inspired by what they saw. The street that had once been perfect lawns and ornamental shrubs now burst with vegetables and fruit trees. Property values actually went up, despite Jennifer's predictions. Turns out people wanted to live in neighborhoods that grew food. I hired 2 more employees that summer, both graduates from Michelle's Sustainable Agriculture program. The operation had grown beyond what I could manage alone. We added a second greenhouse, expanded the heritage seed collection, started a CSA program for weekly vegetable boxes. Every expansion honored Grandma's memory while serving the modern community's needs. One quiet morning in August, I was watering the tomatoes when I noticed movement by the fence. A small bamboo shoot had pushed through, probably from some deep root fragment they'd missed. I stared at it for a long moment, remembering everything that single plant represented. Then I carefully dug it out, making sure to get every bit of root. Dropped it in the burn barrel with the other garden waste. Some things didn't deserve a second chance to take root. The local news picked up the story when our community garden program won a state award for food security innovation. They interviewed me in the greenhouse, surrounded by seedlings ready for the fall garden. I talked about Grandma's vision, the importance of saving seeds, how one small garden could feed so many families. Kept it positive, focused on the future, rather than dwelling on past conflicts. My phone rang constantly after that news segment. Other communities wanted to start similar programs. Schools wanted to bring classes. Publishers wanted more books. I turned down most offers, keeping the focus local. This garden was about community, not fame. Though I did agree to write a monthly column for a gardening magazine, sharing seasonal tips and heritage variety spotlights. The third annual Harvest Festival drew over 500 people. We had to borrow the church parking lot for overflow. Local restaurants set up booths featuring dishes made with heritage vegetables. The high school jazz band played while people picked produce. Kids ran through the garden paths playing tag, their laughter mixing with music and conversation. It felt like Grandma's stories of barn raisings and community harvest come to life. Sarah and I were cleaning up after the festival when she mentioned something. She'd heard Jennifer had moved back to the state, living in a small apartment 2 towns over, working at a garden center of all places, selling plants to customers. Sarah had seen her there last week, almost didn't recognize her. Said Jennifer looked different, humbler maybe. Had asked about me, how the garden was doing. Sarah told her about the festival, the cookbook, all the success. Jennifer had just nodded and gone back to watering the houseplants. I thought about that information for days. Part of me wanted to visit that garden center, see her working retail after all her airs about being above such things. But what would be the point? She'd learned her lesson the hard way. Lost her marriage, her home, her savings, her reputation. All because she couldn't stand someone else succeeding. The bamboo had been her weapon and her downfall. Poetic justice delivered by root and rhizome. Instead, I focused on the future. Plans for a teaching kitchen next to the greenhouse. A scholarship program for low-income students to attend gardening classes. Maybe even a small farm store selling preserved goods year-round. Each idea felt like something Grandma would have loved. Ways to share the garden's abundance with more people. The heritage seeds would keep traveling, finding new gardens and new gardeners. The frost came late that year, extending the growing season into November. I covered the tender plants each night, uncovered them each morning, squeezing every last tomato from the vines. The final harvest was bittersweet, knowing winter would quiet the garden, but the greenhouse would keep going. The seeds would rest and wait. The cycle would begin again in spring. Standing in the garden on the last warm day of fall, I thought about everything that had happened. How Jennifer's attack had actually strengthened the garden's place in the community. How her bamboo had led to a movement of neighborhood food production. How her jealousy had ultimately created more abundance than she'd tried to destroy. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us become the catalyst for our greatest growth. I picked the last perfect tomato of the season, still warm from the sun. Took a bite right there in the garden, juice running down my chin, tasting like summer and memories and home. This is what Jennifer had tried to steal, what she'd never understood. It wasn't about the vegetables or the recognition or even the garden itself. It was about connection, continuity, community, things that can't be destroyed by bamboo or bitterness or anything else. The garden would survive whatever came next. It had survived Jennifer, would survive me too someday. Someone else would tend these plants, save these seeds, share this abundance. That's what heritage means, passing something precious to the next generation. I'd learned that from Grandma, and now I was teaching it to others. The cycle continues, roots deep and branches high, reaching always toward the light.